The European Union told China it expects Beijing to help end Russia's war in Ukraine. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen spoke to reporters after their virtual summit.
We expect China, if not supporting the sanctions, at least to do everything not to interfere in any kind. Also on that point, we were very clear.
This long-scheduled meeting was an opportunity for EU leaders to set out their expectations for Beijing, which has gone out of its way to avoid taking a clear side on Russia's invasion. But it's not clear that Europe won any commitments. So let's discuss all of this with Aaron Friedberg. He is professor of politics and international affairs at Princeton University. He's also the author of a new book, Getting China Wrong. Aaron, welcome to Quick Take. I just want to give you China's take on this virtual summit. There was a tweet that was sent out basically saying that Xi finds it deeply regrettable the situation in Ukraine has come to where it is today. China always stands on the side of peace and draws its conclusion independently based on the merits of each matter. So never mind the diplomatic language there. What specific ideas do you think each side sought to communicate in holding the summit?
This seems to be something of a dialogue of the deaf. I think the EU side was obviously trying very hard to convince China that it shouldn't support Russia, and even threatening that if China did violate European sanctions on Russia, the Europeans would sanction China as well, which would be a major step. The Chinese side presumably trying to split the Europeans away from the United States a little bit. They don't seem to have tried very hard. They don't seem to have offered anything concrete. So really nothing much appears to have come out of this.
Yeah, and to that end, there was no joint statement, no joint press conference. And before the meeting even took place, the EU had said there would be no deliverables, which just gives you a sense of how much importance they placed on it. Yet, the summit did try to tackle the weightiest issues of the day, including Russia and Ukraine, along with climate change and human rights issues, at least from the EU side. What does the summit mean for the incremental evolution of the relationship between China and the EU?
I think it's likely to accelerate the deterioration in that relationship, which has been underway for the last couple of years. Things made worse, I think, in particular by the COVID pandemic and events surrounding that and how China handled that. It's likely to make things worse. The Russians are refusing to take any responsibility, refusing to play any active role, despite the fact that they have advertised their very close relationship with Russia. And if they do now start to take steps to help the Russians, the situation is set up for the imposition of sanctions by the EU on China. So I think we're on the brink of a further deterioration in relations between the EU and China.
Okay, that's certainly concerning. You just published this book that I mentioned, Getting China Wrong, that examines the origins and failures of U.S. engagement with China. To what extent do you think Europe is walking down that same path?
It's been walking down exactly the same path, I think. Slightly different rhetoric to describe what was going on. But going back to the 90s and the end of the Cold War, both in Europe and the United States, there's been an assumption, and not only regarding China, but regarding Russia too, that engagement, and in particular economic engagement with these countries, would set in motion forces which would encourage their eventual economic and political liberalization and would make them sort of status quo powers and part of a stable world order. And none of that has worked. I think people in the United States have started to come to that recognition in the last few years, and so too have the Europeans, and these events are going to accelerate that process.
Yeah, and I think about how some people in Europe had called this summit, which of course took place on April 1st, an April Fool's Day summit. In the relationship between Europe and China, who is fooling who when it comes to understanding each other's capability? What is the power dynamic in the relationship?
Until very recently, it would have appeared that the Chinese had an advantage because they were dealing with the European countries separately, because they had such important economic relationships with a number of them, including some very important countries like Germany. And the Europeans were having difficulty, as they often have, in coordinating their policies and achieving some kind of consensus about how they wanted to deal with China. But events in Ukraine and the European response to those events, I think, has also accelerated the solidification of a consensus on the need to take a much tougher line with China. So I think that kind of evens the balance out. And it was interesting before the summit, EU leaders made the point that China is still very heavily dependent on both the EU and the US market. I think together they amount for something like 25% of China's exports, and Russia's only 2 or 3%. So the Europeans are flexing their muscles a little bit, and they're doing that also, again, with respect to this threat to impose sanctions. So I think there's been an equalization in the relationship.
Yeah, I want to get to that sanctions point because the EU and the US keep hammering home this idea that China would pay a really high economic price if it continues to side with Russia and support the war in Ukraine. Is this the right framework to be speaking to China? Does China even think in those terms?
Well, the official Chinese position on all of this is that they oppose sanctions. In particular, they oppose what they refer to as unilateral sanctions, and there they're talking about the US. And won't participate in them. But the fact is, at least as far as we know thus far, they've also been quite careful about doing things that would openly violate the sanctions and prop up Putin's regime, because the US in particular has, and now the Europeans too, have threatened to sanction Chinese entities if they went ahead and did this and pursued business as usual with Russia. I think it's part of an overall US and European and Western effort to put as much pressure on the Putin regime as possible to try to bring the war in Ukraine to a successful conclusion. And the Chinese refusal to take part in that makes it clear that, on balance, they're siding with Russia. They claim to be neutral, but they're really not.
I know that big minds think about big ideas, small minds think about people, but I wonder if there are any specific individual players in China, Europe, and the US who would have the wherewithal, the capability, the most reach in actually getting the other side to really hear them out and bridge some of the gaps that we have in this relationship.
I'm afraid such people may no longer exist. At least it's not evident to me who they would be. The Chinese regime has been increasingly closed off, not very interested in exchanges. Just this week, the government imposed a ban on the participation by Chinese academics in academic conferences. So they're not really interested, I think, in hearing what's coming from the other side. The Chinese have believed in the past, and in the past they have been right, that they could exert a lot of influence, particularly in the United States, by working through a few individuals and through business interests that had a loud voice in the U.S. politics. But that doesn't seem to have worked for them either. And I think they're still trying, but I don't think they have a lot of confidence in their ability to alter the path that the U.S. is on. In fact, I would say overall, what we're seeing suggests that the Chinese have come to the conclusion that both Europe and the United States are now going to take a much harder line towards them. And there's nothing they can do to prevent that. So they're just pushing ahead. They're
just moving ahead. If that's the perception on the Chinese end, how aligned are the US and Europe when it comes to their strategic goals on China?
Well, that's really the key question, and it remains to be determined. And I think there's even a question, although it's a smaller one, about how much Europe and the United States are aligned exactly on how to deal with Russia. At least thus far, we've been very closely aligned, and that's what's made possible these dramatic and really unprecedented sanctions. Whether that'll hold up over time remains to be seen. There's been a bigger gap, I think, even over the last few years between Europe and the United States on dealing with China. And some people in Europe have advocated taking an independent position or strategic autonomy, trying perhaps to balance between the United States and China. It seems to me that possibility is evaporating, and there's an increasing sense in Europe, judging from the way in which this summit was handled, that they have to join with the United States and take a much tougher line than they have in the past towards China. As far as I could tell, there was absolutely no daylight in the position that the EU representatives took and the position of the US government. And that hasn't always been true.
Right. So that is a change there. It's hard not to get the sense that this slow deterioration of EU-China relations is kind of just the default path that's going to happen, that's going to unfold, and it's the path of least resistance. What would accelerate or reverse this deterioration in a meaningful way?
Well, we've seen a number of things that have accelerated it. and I mentioned the pandemic and now this, I think there's still a strong desire on the part of many in Europe to patch things up and a hope that you can go back to business as usual. But again, that seems to be dwindling. At the beginning of the Ukraine crisis, there were a few people here, and I guess in Europe too, who expressed the hope that China would now draw closer to the West, pull away from Russia, join the rest of the world as they saw it in opposing this act of aggression. But that really hasn't happened. And it seems to suggest, again, that we're on this path towards deteriorating relations. The thing that may slow it down is the mutual economic interest on both sides in trying to preserve what's still a profitable economic relationship. But politics has a way of overwhelming economics at times of crisis. And I think that's what we're starting to see here. We've already seen that again with respect to Russia. Major companies pulling out of Russia to a degree that I certainly found surprising, as well as the imposition of these sanctions. So it seems that we're on this path. My reading of it from the Chinese side is that first, they hope that they can still continue to have access to the US market, to the European market, at least for some period of time. But they're headed towards a world in which they're going to be increasingly insulated from Western economic pressure and less reliant on the West than they've been.
Yeah, and they've accepted and kind of molded their economy for that scenario. Aaron,
Exactly.
Thank you so much. Aaron Friedberg is professor of politics and international affairs at Princeton University. He is also the author of Getting China Wrong.